Welcome to this George C. Marshall Foundation Legacy Series lecture. My name is William A. Taylor, and it's December 10th, 2020. And you can reach me at william.taylor@angelo.edu. I'd like to start with just some brief introductions and acknowledgments. As I said, my name is William A. Taylor, Bill Taylor. I'm the Lee Drain Endowed University Professor at Angelo State University. We're located in San Angelo, Texas. A little bit about my educational background. I went to undergraduate at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. I then did a master's degree in history at the University of Maryland, another master's degree in national security studies at Georgetown University, and then I did my master of philosophy and PhD in history at George Washington University. So I have a background in history, specifically military history, but also in national security studies as well. And I did graduate from the Naval Academy and was commissioned an officer in the United States Marine Corps. And I served in the Marine Corps from 1998 to 2004. So just over 6.5 years, and served in a variety of assignments with 3 Marine Expeditionary Force Development Center, and Marine Corps Combat Development Command. I'd like to give some brief acknowledgments to the George C. Marshall Foundation, just for all the wonderful work that they do at the foundation, and also for the support that they've given me in my own educational and academic career. Very early on in my academic career, when I was transitioning from the military to a PhD student, they awarded me a George C. Marshall Baruch Fellowship, and that enabled me to do really my first foray into archival research at the George C. Marshall Research Library in Lexington, Virginia. And so it's very productive, and I appreciate the support and the great work that they do there. My talk today is entitled "The Obligation to Serve," and throughout the talk, I'll have some quotes that I'll read to you. And the reason I do this is to get a sense of the documents and the words and actions of the historical actors. So to take it away necessarily from me, to hear what the actors like George C. Marshall are saying in their own words. And so there's no better place to begin than with George C. Marshall. And this is him speaking in 1951. Quote, "Our failure to provide for universal military training in 1920 and the tragic repetition of that era following World War II are largely responsible for the call we must make on our young men today. I'm convinced that it would not now be necessary to interrupt the normal course of their lives if we had taken the conservative, wise action, an effort that was defeated largely by emotional rather than logical reactions," end quote. And that's George C. Marshall talking about the obligation to serve in 1951. And so what he's talking about there is universal military training. So that's something I've studied quite a bit throughout my career. And my newest book, which you see here, is George C. Marshall in the Early Cold War, Policy, Politics, and Society. And so I had the great honor of leading a team of esteemed scholars to look at and revisit Marshall's role in the early Cold War. And the volume ranges roughly from 1945 through Marshall's death in 1959. And it covers a vast array of areas where Marshall had tremendous influence, and we don't have time to cover all of them, but I would recommend you take a look at the book if you're interested in these issues. I'm going to cover universal military training today. That's what this lecture of the obligation to serve will be about. But this volume is filled with other areas where Marshall was very pivotal, including China's Civil War, Independent Air Force, National Security Act in 1947, control of atomic weapons, the European Recovery Program, or Marshall Plan, which bears his name, the North Atlantic Treaty, the Korean War, and finally, racial integration of the U.S. military. So those are all the topics covered in that, and we'll use my chapter on universal military training as a segue for this lecture. A couple other works that you might find interesting that delve into this topic and are relevant to this topic. One is Military Service in American Democracy, and this is a book that I did several years ago and has just been re-released with a new edition and paperback edition in 2020. And in this book, I really try to answer two questions. Who serves in the US military and how? Looking at how it's changed over time. So each chapter then becomes a debate about military service over the years, and it covers 1945, including universal military training, but also comes to full circle to the present day and looks at more current issues such as the privatization of force in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and the use of private military contractors. So this is something, if you're interested in universal military training or military service writ large, you might find interesting as well. And then finally, Every Citizen a Soldier, my first book, The Campaign for Universal Military Training After World War II. And so this is a volume, to my knowledge, it's the only book-length treatment of universal military training available. And so this tells the story in great detail. The entire book is focused on what we're going to talk about today. And so if you find these topics interesting, you might check out these works. They all deal significantly with George C. Marshall and his legacy. They all deal a great deal with resources from George C. Marshall Research Library. And so these are great ways to look at Marshall's legacy and see indeed what a pivotal figure he was throughout the 20th century. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about universal military training. What is it, and how did the campaign unfold as the U.S. transitioned from World War II to the Cold War? And so this is The Trainee Comes Home, and this is actually from a UMT brochure that the U.S. War Department produced, and we'll talk about their marketing efforts as this lecture unfolds. But this is a brochure in which they were pitching the idea of universal military training. Quote, "The trainee has given up a year to his country. In return, he has acquired confidence that as long as he and other boys like him are prepared for the eventuality of combat, they can look forward to a prosperous future untroubled by war," end quote. And that's the War Department in 1945 in their UMT brochure. And so by way of introduction, some of the major themes of this lecture on universal military training are going to be about national security versus individual liberty. So this is an important dichotomy in American history all the way to the present day. So most Americans would agree that there are important issues about national security, that that's a foundational concept in America, and that we need to ensure defense of our country. But on the other hand, we're also a nation founded on individual liberty, and individual liberty holds a very cherished and central place in American society. And so how do we balance these two valid yet often competing concepts in which are in constant tension? And that was one of the themes of the Campaign for Universal Military Training. Another one is the emergence of the United States as a significant military power after World War II. And so it's easy to forget that prior to World War II, the U.S. military was relatively small. And that was only after World War II when the United States military really was a global superpower. Perhaps it's best described as a regional power prior to World War II, and after World War II, a major world power, especially in terms of military strength. And then the concept of strategic fixation. This is a concept I developed in my written work, and the idea that as these Army leaders, including Marshall, were looking at universal military training, they often came to hold it as a panacea. And while they had very valid reasons for doing so, they failed to account for a backup plan. What would happen if you didn't get your desired policy outcome, which in this case was universal military training? And that fixation then on one possible policy outcome hurt the grand strategy in terms of not having alternatives and viable backup plans. And then in terms of civil military relations, we'll see as this unfolds how this is a military plan at its core, but it also needs the support of civilians, specifically civilian politicians. And so because of that, there's this real tension between the military part of this plan and then the way it's viewed by civilians, that it starts to become different things to different people. And we'll see how that's the case as this unfolds. And then finally, this is an important story because of its outcome. So a lot of people aren't even familiar with universal military training, or that it was highly debated and highly sought after by many individuals in power. What they are familiar with is the draft, the Cold War draft, which came to be because of the failure of UMT. And so the outcome, as UMT fails to become a reality, the Cold War draft does, and that is with us then after 1948, all the way through 1973, with the advent of the all-volunteer force. And then finally, one thing that got me intrigued in this topic in the very first place was that many people supported UMT. Obviously, Marshall was a huge advocate of it. President Truman became a huge advocate of it and asked for it at least 8 times during his presidency. Many figures in Congress were supportive of it. And the general public, when surveyed, often came back with 75 and 80% approval of it. So given that it had this widespread and broad support, why did it not come to fruition? So I look at that and kind of ask that question. And then finally, I end the conclusion today will be the paradox of preparedness. This is a concept that I've developed in my written work. And the idea is that there are short-term and long-term policy outcomes. And oftentimes they're dictated by whether you're in a peaceful situation or a tense crisis situation. And so in a peaceful situation, you can pursue the long-term strategy, the long-term outcome, but you often don't have the urgency in which to get it accomplished. But when things get far more tense and the urgency becomes real, it privileges the short-term solution over the long-term. And that's what happens with selective service in the draft, with selective service being the short-term solution, and universal military training then, on the other hand, in contrast, is the long-term solution. A grave decision. So 1945, this is the Washington Post. Quote, "This nation faces a grave decision whether or not to continue in peacetime the drafting of its young men for military training. The proposal concerns not only every boy and parent, but every citizen of this country. It involves our national post-war security and the world's post-war peace," end quote. Once again, that's 1945, the Washington Post. And this really gets us to the situation as the United States is emerging from World War II and moving into what would become the early Cold War. And so the United States has to decide on what its post-war national security structure will look like. What will that strategy be based on? And one possible alternative that is talked about quite a bit is UMT, or universal military training. It's the concept that every 18-year-old male in America would go off to do 1 year of mandatory military training, at the conclusion of which they could go back to their civilian life. So unlike the draft, which required service as well, UMT does not require service. I mean, certainly these young men are welcome to continue on in the reserves or in the active component, but they're not required to. And so that's the concept. And the reason for it is it would create a general reserve. It would create this way to speed mobilization, and we'll talk about that as this unfolds. But essentially, this is a 5-year campaign from 1943 through 1948. It's preceded by a previous campaign that happens around World War I, and it's followed by a later campaign. When we started this lecture, I mentioned George Marshall speaking in 1951 about the obligation to serve. That's the third campaign for universal military training, which coincides with the Korean War. But the most vicious, strongest, largest advocacy of UMT really takes place from 1943 through 1948. And it becomes a major debate in American society. This idea that it's talked about in Congress, it's talked about in newspapers and magazines. And in fact, in 1946, it's often required in high school debates. It's the national high school debate topic at the time. And so all these young high schoolers on debate teams are debating whether or not the United States should have UMT. The spirit of 1920. And so James W. Wadsworth, who is, the quote is from here, is a major congressional power. He's a congressman from New York. He actually was previously a senator from New York. And so he's a national security specialist. He really focuses on issues of national security during his time in Congress, and he's a huge advocate of UMT along with Marshall. He works closely with Marshall and others to press this plan forward. And he says here, quote, "Despite our very best efforts, we failed utterly in persuading the Senate that the universal military training should be included in the National Defense Act. The opposition to it was overwhelming. We had no chance. The comment most frequently heard in opposition to the provision was, 'Oh, what's the use of imposing such an obligation upon young men in time of peace? There will never be another war.'" That was the spirit of 1920, as you may remember. Now, 20 years later, I find myself assuming the effort, this time with a better chance of success, end quote. And that's James W. Wadsworth, congressman from New York, speaking in 1940 about UMT. What he's talking about is this experience of the Great War, this idea that there was a movement for UMT, both before, during, and after World War I. It was referred to as the Plattsburgh movement, named after one of the training camps in Plattsburgh, New York. And this idea that these voluntary training camps would exist around the country to prepare for mobilization for World War I. And so it's really the predecessor to UMT after World War II, and it's this Plattsburgh movement. So it also looks at the rapid demobilization that happened after World War I, and the idea that Marshall and many others like him who advocate for UMT see the World War I experience as an opportunity lost. They had pushed for UMT to be included in the National Defense Act at the time. It was initially, and then it eventually gets cut out. And so they feel this as a real opportunity lost. And in a way, it vindicates their position that they had argued you need to maintain preparedness so that you wouldn't have another war. And here in their own lifetime, they're back to another world war. And so they think and argue that if only they had enacted UMT, perhaps they could have prevented that or deterred that from happening. But they remember the severe budget cuts from Congress, which eviscerated the Army after World War I, and really cut it to the bone and limited the force structure that the Army was able to implement. And so Marshall and many other Army leaders really agonize about that and are fearful of the parsimony of Congress after World War II and whether they'll do the same thing after that conflict has ended as well. The basis for all plans. So the solution then becomes to Marshall and many others for UMT. And it always starts as a military plan. And so there's a strategic rationale for why you would want to have these 18-year-olds go through a year of military training, and that is to improve and speed mobilization. That you would allow them to do a lot of the training ahead of time, and they would go into this general reserve where there were civilians, but they have already completed this year of military training. And the idea is that would improve the military, it would improve military mobilization, and that's the crux of the military side of it. But as I alluded to earlier, these military leaders, including George Marshall, someone as high a stature as Marshall, had to convince civilian politicians to implement this, that the military couldn't do this on its own, it had to come through Congress. And so they also start reluctantly and kind of slowly talking about the political advantages of this plan and also the social benefits. People start talking about this would be a good way to improve national health, or it'd be a good way to eradicate illiteracy, or it'd be a good way to homogenize the nation in terms of bringing together these young men from disparate backgrounds, both economically and socially and geographically, and bring them together in this common experience that all American youth would have. And that's the debate then starts to evolve into these many other areas. And that's what makes it really intriguing and interesting. So here we have George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff from around 1945. And this is one of the photos of his 5-star rank. And so he becomes really the most prominent figure, public figure, to advocate for UMT, as well as President Truman. There are many others, and I'll talk about a lot of them at the grassroots level and kind of behind the scenes. But Marshall really believes in universal military training. He really thinks it's should be the basis of the early Cold War grand strategy, especially for the Army. and he advocates for it throughout his time, including as Army Chief of Staff, but also later as Secretary of State, and then also Secretary of Defense. He never abandons this plan and advocates for it, even when it goes down to defeat, both in 1948 and then again in 1951, which we'll talk about. So target number 1, USA. What this is referring to is a Collier's Magazine article. And I want to read this quote to you to give you a sense of the perspective at the time. This is Collier's Magazine in 1945. Quote, "If there is a World War III, any nation or alliance which hopes to topple Britain, China, France, Russia, and the United States can be counted on to read the lessons of World War I and World War II. Outstanding among those lessons will be, hit the United States first and as hard as possible. Do not give American producing power and war willingness a chance to build up muscle for 2 or 3 years behind a protective screen of other fighting nations," end quote. And that's Collier's Magazine, 1945. And what it's referring to is this sense that the strategic landscape has changed after World War II. The United States has benefited throughout its history from positive and beneficial geography, these 2 large oceans, the Atlantic and Pacific to our east and west, and friendly neighbors in Canada and Mexico to our north and south, had really protected the United States from large-scale invasion or attack in a way that many of our allies did not benefit from. And so there's a sense that this is no longer enough, that this is no longer going to protect the United States. The reason why is technology, that technology has improved so drastically during World War II with large-scale amphibious operations, long-range strategic bombing, and perhaps most visibly the advent of the atomic age, have all called this into question. And we had always been, as Americans, able to rely on our alliances, and our allies would hold the line and kind of conduct a holding action while the United States can mobilize over a lengthy period of time, often 18 months, 2 years, something to that nature. But that's no longer considered enough. That it's most experts at this time are talking that you need to mobilize in shorter than 6 months. And we've never done that before. So this is a newfound insecurity. And the UMT becomes the answer for many of these advocates, where they say if you do the training ahead of time, then you can mobilize and you can bring it down from about 18 months or 24 months down to about 6 months because the training is done ahead of time. But at the same time, not only does it become the answer, but it becomes the panacea, that there's no real thought to what do we do if we don't get this, because the military, especially the Army, can't implement this on its own. It needs Congress to implement this. And so that's where we go back to that strategic fixation idea, which I think is a relevant part of this story. Preaching the gospel. So this is Walter L. Weibel. He's a general in the War Department, and he's speaking in 1945. And he's really the point person in terms of training. He's the director of military training. And he says, quote, "Last summer, War Department Circular 347, 1944, outlined the position of the War Department on the question of universal military training. Secretary of War and the Chief of Staff, Marshall, consider it a project secondary only to winning the war. We have had public relations officers and service command representatives in here orienting them so that they could preach the gospel before the public," end quote. So that's Walter Weibel, Director of Military Training in the War Department, and he's talking about preaching the gospel. And this is really the marketing effort that the Army predominantly will take up, and it's really trying to convince 2 audiences to pass UMT. One is Congress. It has to have Congress pass this. This is the Selective Service Act is coming up for renewal in 1948. So obviously in 1939, we had the first peacetime draft, and that continues all the way through the end of the war and past the end of the war. And in 1948 then is the first real renewal during a peacetime environment. And so what's that going to look like? These advocates, including Marshall, are saying, let's implement UMT instead. So they want to convince Congress, but they also want to convince the American public. And so it's this pretty rigorous and aggressive marketing effort. John J. McCloy, who is Undersecretary in the War Department, he's kind of the point civilian who leads this effort. And then I mentioned Walter Weibel, who is a general. He is the point military person, both then coordinating closely with George C. Marshall. And they go on the radio waves. They write op-ed pieces, articles in newspapers and magazines, and even scholarly journals. And they mobilize a Bureau of Public Relations within the War Department. And they also coordinate with civilians. So there's a Citizens Committee for Military Training of Young Men. And these are prominent civilians who form this advocacy group to really push for UMT. And it's interesting to see how they coordinate between the official government position and then also these outsiders who are civilians who want the same thing. Here is John J. McCloy in 1945, Undersecretary of War. And as I said, he becomes one of the leading civilian proponents of UMT, working closely with George Marshall and others to really get the news out about UMT to the nation and throughout the government. A pig in a poke. And what I mean by this is the criticism of UMT. So while I alluded to earlier, there's a large and broad support for UMT, albeit it's fractured in the sense that UMT becomes different things to different people. There is fairly broad support of it in general. The consensus breaks down when you get into the details of what it would actually look like, but the concept itself is widely supported, but not by everybody. It's important to remember not everybody supports this, and that's what this slide really speaks to, is there are people who are against this for a variety of reasons, and we'll talk about that. So this is Yank magazine in 1945. Quote, Congress is mulling over legislation on the subject of universal military training. Propaganda agencies representing hundreds of civic, labor, religious, industrial, and veterans organizations are spending heavy money trying to influence people on both sides of the fence. College students debate the issue in classrooms. Barflies have come to blows over it, end quote. That's Yank magazine in 1945 talking about the contentious debates that occur around UMT. And so who are the people who are against UMT? And it's important to note that when I outline this in general terms, these are not monolithic blocks. There's a lot of diversity even within each of these groups, but generally speaking, pacifist organizations are against UMT. And the line of argument for them is primarily based on a fear that this would lead to a militarized American society. That the argument they make is, look at the militarized societies that we just fought. Germany and Italy had this type of thing and they lost. So it's not necessary for a peaceful democracy to have something like UMT. Labor unions are against it generally, but for a far different reason. They're fearful that these young men, 17, 18-year-olds, going off to these camps might not come back to the labor unions where they need to apprentice in a trade, do apprenticeships, and then fill the labor union member roles. And labor unions are very powerful at this time in a way that we have to remember in the 1940s and 50s, a very powerful part of society. And so they're fearful this would hurt labor union membership. Religious groups in general are against it, although once again, some of the leading advocates for it are from religious groups. But in general, they're against it for far different reasons, based primarily on morality, that there's these fears that these training camps for youth in their 17s and 18-year-olds would fester with immorality and temptation as they're away from parental influence. And then some veterans are opposed to UMT. Most veterans groups are strongly in support of it, as evidenced by the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars. But some veterans are against it primarily on military grounds, that they think something like this is focused on a large army might be anachronistic, that we're in the era of push-button warfare is a phrase from the time. Technology seems to be making great advances, and so some of these military people are arguing that it's unnecessary and ineffective way to proceed. And then finally, education leaders, in much the same vein as labor unions, are fearful that These young people who should be going to college or university will go off to these training camps and never come back. And so it might hurt educational prospects of the nation, but also hurt enrollment at their various institutions. A matter of broad policy. And so this is the Woodrum Committee. It was a committee that was formed to formulate post-war strategy. So as the United States came out of World War II, to look at what needed to happen moving forward to make the United States secure. And that's the Woodrum Committee. And this is a quote from them. Quote, "For these and for other reasons, your committee therefore recommends that the Congress adopt as a matter of broad policy a system of universal military training for the critical years ahead," end quote. And that's the Woodrum Committee coming out strongly in support of UMT. And so, as I mentioned before, George C. Marshall and other military leaders had to garner political allies to make UMT a reality. And so they worked on doing that. They worked very aggressively at doing that. In fact, Congress would twice hold hearings in which they chided the Army for being too aggressive in the way it was marketing and publicizing for UMT. But they garnered these allies. President Truman is an excellent example where he believed wholeheartedly in UMT and came around to be one of the staunchest advocates. But you also see this subtle shift when President Truman talks about universal military training. He's talking more about national health, combating illiteracy, or inculcating citizenship, so these societal or political benefits. He's not talking a lot about mobilization, which is where George C. Marshall sees the benefit of UMT. And so you see what I would argue is a political metamorphosis where UMT starts to become different things to different people. And that's where it starts losing momentum, because when Marshall's making the argument that we need this to improve military mobilization, that's a very strong foundation. It's hard to argue with the military logic of it. But once the debate broadens and starts becoming more about social issues, then there's a lot more critiques that come in, and we'll see that as this lecture unfolds about how that becomes a case. But there's a metamorphosis in terms of what UMT represents. So here is President Harry S. Truman from around 1945, and just as Marshall becomes the most public face and figure of UMT's support from a military stance, President Truman then becomes the face of UMT support from a civilian and political stance. And so those are two important people in this story. The Fort Knox experiment. And so the Army has to convert UMT from an idea to a reality. And so the way they do that is they establish an experimental unit at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and that's what this refers to. This is Time magazine from 1947, and Time magazine says, quote, "Congress, conscious of votes and mothers, would be hard to persuade, but the Army had a test tube experiment in which UMT was apparently working well. From its youngest recruits, it had drawn a battalion, made them UMT guinea pigs at Fort Knox," end quote. And that's Time magazine, 1947. And so the Army sets up this UMT experimental unit. It's to take the idea from theory to reality, and it has two missions. Unlike most military units that have a military mission, it has both a military mission and also a public relations mission. So it does two things. One is to experiment with how you do UMT. So that's more for the Army. How would you conduct the training? And then the second mission, to demonstrate to the nation that it can be done successfully and that it would be beneficial. And so that's important to know about this experimental unit. It has two missions. Most battalions, which this unit is a battalion, would be headed by a lieutenant colonel. This unit's headed by a brigadier general, which indicates how important it is to the Army. And this is Johnny Devine. And he's a decorated combat hero from World War II. So they give it a general. They also give it this massive public relations staff, which most battalions don't have. They give it its own band, the UMT Highlighters, which play all these shows around town to garner support. And they give it its own newspaper, the UMT Pioneer. And to indicate the dissemination goal, Every trainee gets not one newspaper, but two, with the idea that they will then give it out and promulgate the great things that are happening at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and the UMT Experimental Unit. So here is Lieutenant General Jacob L. Devers visiting with one of the cadre of the unit and talking with them. So it gets all these high-level visitors coming to take a look at it and also to promote what's happening. Here is Johnny Devine. He's instructing one of the trainees. You'll notice how young this young man looks, and the triangle on his helmet is the actual insignia of the UMT unit. So that was what is envisioned they would wear in the future when this becomes a reality. A program for national security. So at the same time that the experimental unit is going on, there's also this Presidential Advisory Commission that President Truman sets up. And here President Truman is speaking in 1946, and he says, I want you to be known as the President's Advisory Commission on Universal Training. I want the word military left out. The military phase is incidental to what I have in mind, end quote. It's Harry Truman speaking in 1946. And what's important about this is that he sets up this President's Advisory Commission on Universal Training. Notice it's not universal military training to him. And it's headed by Carl Compton, president of MIT and a well-regarded scientist. And it comes after studying and holding tons of hearings and tons of publicity. They come out with a unanimous recommendation for UMT. So this gives President Truman the ability to say, I've had civilian endorsement of this, that they think this is necessary. We've already had military endorsement from people like George C. Marshall. And so now we can move forward with it. That's his hope. But of course, one thing, as I alluded to earlier, in mentioning the societal benefits of it, it also broadens the debate. And so now it's about the implications for American society. And that's where it starts to unravel for the campaign for universal military training, because far more criticisms come in for social reasons than for military ones. So here's President Truman holding the report from his advisory commission. Those are some of the prominent members of the commission, and they're celebrating this unanimous recommendation. Here's President Truman. He takes that recommendation and he takes it to Congress. So Congress is seated in the chair in this cartoon, and President Truman has a unanimous recommendation for UMT by the President's Advisory Commission. And he says, take it or leave it at our peril. So he now hopes this will be enough to push it over the edge towards successful completion. But as I mentioned, it opens up questions about what would the normal way of life in America look like. And here is A. Philip Randolph, an African-American civil rights leader, highly regarded and well-known. And he says here in this quote, we are launching in the Negro and liberal press a nationwide expose of the race-minded UMT clique. Their hysterical campaign for a Jim Crow bill is threatening every substantial gain won by Negroes. We call upon responsible leaders and liberals in both parties to crack down on this new style lunch party, which would surrender Negro boys to Mississippi Army officers without legislative safeguards, end quote. And that's A. Philip Randolph, African-American civil rights leader, speaking in 1948 against UMT. So you can see with the normal way of life how race relations starts to become a prominent theme. What would this look like? The military has already said that these training camps would be located exclusively in the South due to good weather. So the military has a military problem. We need to get the training done in 1 year. So the solution then is going to be put them all in the South. Obviously, that has major social ramifications because of segregation and Jim Crow throughout the South. And the concern is that this would take segregation from being a uniquely Southern phenomenon to being the new national status quo, because every 18-year-old male, whether they're from Maine or California or Michigan or Minnesota, would be going to these camps in the Deep South. And so there's a lot of pushback against this. This committee against Jim Crow military service and training has stood up, just like there's a civilian committee for UMT, there's now one against UMT. And A. Philip Randolph really leads that effort. And his counterpart is Truman K. Gibson, who's also African-American, but he works as special advisor to the Secretary of War, and he is an advocate of UMT and thinks it will be beneficial for African-Americans. So that pairing then kind of personifies the debate about race in UMT. So here's Truman K. Gibson, civilian aide to the Secretary of War, and he's a proponent of it in contrast to A. Philip Randolph, who's against it. Well, things heat up in 1948, and a shock throughout the civilized world covers this, where it looks at there's a real optimism that UMT is finally getting close to passing. So Archibald Thatcher is here. He says, on the whole, I think that the old team, although its uniforms may be a little shop-worn, is approaching the goal line and will score a touchdown, end quote. And he is a civilian advocate of UMT. And what it shows is it shows that there's this rising optimism for UMT in 1948. But at the same time that happens, there's international crises in 1948. In February, there's a coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia. In March, the Marshall Plan rolls out, which causes a lot of antagonism and tension with the Soviet Union. Same thing in March with the Brussels Treaty and heightening tensions with the Soviet Union. In May, the recognition of Israel. And then in June, the Berlin blockade. So 1948 is very tense internationally. And then you add to that the domestic politics of the year, the Republican Congress, which came into power in a surprise election in the midterm in 1946, is blocking President Truman's every move. There's a lot of antagonism domestically between the Republican Congress and President Truman. And so selective service is coming up for renewal in the summer of 1948. And that's where these advocates of UMT hope to pass it in lieu of selective service. So here's President Truman in a cartoon again, and he says there's three things we need after World War II and the early Cold War. One is ERP. You see the bats to your left there. The European Recovery Plan or the Marshall Plan is one of them. We need universal training. Notice that he leaves out the military in his view, and we need that as the long-term solution. And then in the short term, only the short term, we need selective service as a bridge to get us to UMT. And he says to Congress, he warns them, we must be ready to back up what we say. So in conclusion, we're to the paradox of preparedness. And this is a concept that I crafted in my written work to explain the defeat of UMT in 1948. And as it comes to a head, there's a lot of optimism. It starts moving forward. You have these international crises. And it goes down to defeat. UMT gets defeated, and instead the Cold War draft gets revived in 1948, and it would be with us to 1973. The same thing happens in the third campaign, where we started with Marshall's remarks on the obligation to serve in 1951. There's an optimism that UMT would be enacted, and then the Korean War breaks out. And as those tensions rise, the short-term solution, in both cases, the draft, gets privileged over the long-term solution, which is UMT. And so once that happens, there's a Pyrrhic victory in 1951 where they say, we'll give you universal military training and service law. So you notice that UMT is in the name, but only in name only. All the provisions to actually implement UMT are stripped out of it. And so it gives the advocates of UMT kind of this Pyrrhic victory where they actually achieve UMT in name only on a bill that actually resurrects and continues the draft. And so exemptions and deferments for the draft start to rise from this period moving forward and become problematic by the Vietnam War. And in many ways, Marshall and others like him were very prescient because they had always said it needed to be universal. If you allow exemptions and deferments, it will become unpopular because people will ask the very valid question, who serves when not everybody serves? And that would in fact be a commission, the title of a commission during the LBJ administration when questions about the draft start heating up. And so this paradox of preparedness, in conclusion, is the idea that selective service is the short-term solution for many of these military leaders. UMT is the long-term solution. And during peacetime planning, they actually make gains and have momentum to enact UMT, but they never have the urgency. They can't get the urgency to generate the urgency to get it over the finish line. But when there's wartime urgency, as there is in 1948 and again in 1951, that wartime urgency privileges the short-term solution. So selective service then rises above UMT because it can produce soldiers immediately whereas UMT, even if enacted, would take about a year to a year and a half to actually start producing that general reserve, whereas selective service could start producing it almost immediately. And so I want to thank you all. I know we went through a lot of material very quickly. I would encourage you, if these piqued your interest, to take a look at the books. The most recent one, George C. Marshall in the Early Cold War, covers UMT in great detail, especially the 1951 campaign during the Korean War, but also a range of other valuable topics that reflect on Marshall's legacy. And then if you have an interest in UMT, specifically, the Military Service and American Democracy book covers it in the World War II context. And then, of course, Every Citizen and Soldier covers it in a book-length treatment where it goes through all the details of everything that we just talked about today. But I want to thank you all so much for being here today. I want to thank the George C. Marshall Foundation for allowing me to give this legacy lecture series and really reflect upon Marshall's pivotal influence in 20th century American history, and that resonates even today. So thank you so much. Stay in touch, and if I can ever help, please let me know.